In this video, we're going to discuss different parameters that we're going to use to manage routing. Our hypothetical situation is the following. We have a customer that wants to call this number in Zimbabwe. I've specifically picked a country that is not so frequently called in order not to mess up any existing configurations on our demo system. As the owner of the PortaSwitch, we have signed partnerships with the following carriers. We have carrier A, B, C, and D that have rates to Zimbabwe, and we also have carrier E that doesn't terminate calls to Zimbabwe. It terminates calls only to European destinations. When the customer dials this number, PortaSwitch will request authorization and routing specifications from PortaBilling. And PortaBilling in its turn is going to return a possible routing list. The most straightforward way to calculate the routes is to make a list of all the vendors that have a connection to the destination and then sort the carriers in the order of ascending price, or it's also called least cost route. So if we sort our carriers according to their cost, we're going to have the cheapest route at the top and the most expensive at the bottom. The first route is therefore going to be our carrier C, then carriers A, B, and finally D. Let's go to our web interface and perform a routing simulation. For that, we go to Infrastructure, Voice Calls Processing, Routing Simulation. Here, let's enter the number we are going to dial and click Test. And the routing list that we have here is exactly the same as we've seen on our slide. The cheapest carrier at 7.9 cents a minute is carrier C, then comes carrier A, then B, and our most expensive carrier is D at 25 cents a minute. Possible problems may we encounter if we use LCR for our routing calculations. Our carrier C is only cheaper than carrier A by 1/10 of a cent. This price may have been set on purpose by carrier C to outbid the other carriers and to get to the top of the routing list. But carrier C provides really poor quality of call termination compared to A. Trying to chase the cheapest price, we may inadvertently provide very poor quality of calls to our customers, and this is exactly why we need another criteria for carrier management besides the rate. We need an additional parameter. It's called preference. It's a numerical rating from 0 to 10, being 10 the highest and 0 the lowest. Preference tells us whether we want to move a route up or down in the routing list. Let's suppose that in our tariff, we've just added the following preference values. So our vendors A and B are going to have preference 5, our vendor D preference 4, and our vendor C is going to have preference 3. Preference 5 is the default parameter. So we didn't need to modify anything on our web interface. We just needed to modify it for carrier D and C. Carrier C moved to the bottom of the list, having the lowest preference. So if the customer dials the same exact number, now carrier A will be at the top of the list and carrier C will be at the bottom of the list. The routing list will be first sorted by descending preference, and then carriers with the same preference value are going to be sorted by cost in the ascending order. A and B have the same preference, so they're going to be sorted according to their cost. A is the cheapest, so it's going to be at the top of the list, and B is going to come next. Let's go back to our web interface and change the preference for our rate to Zimbabwe in the tariff for carrier C. So let's go to carrier C and to connections. The tariff is linked to a connection, so we can click here and we're going to get to the tariff directly. Let's go to rates. This is our rate to Zimbabwe. And let's change the preference. Okay, let's go to edit. The default preference is 5. Our goal is to change it to 3. Okay, let's change it to 3 and click save. Let's do the same for our carrier D. Let's find the tariff for carrier D here in the tariff list. Instead of going to the connection, go to rates, edit. We need to scroll to the right to get to the edit menu. Let's go to edit and change our preference to 4. Now let's click save and go back to our simulation of routing. So let's dial the same number and click test. Now our list has changed. A and B have the highest preference. They are at the top of the list, ordered by least cost because they have the same preference. And then we have carrier D with preference 4 and carrier C with preference 3. We can customize these columns to make sure preference is easily visible. So let's move it here somewhere. Yeah, now we can see the preference. Okay, what we've just seen in our web interface looks really good. But let's imagine that carrier C has really unacceptable quality to Zimbabwe, and we don't want to send our calls to this carrier at all. It's better that the call doesn't go through at all, and the customer has to redial whenever carriers A, B, or D are available, than to connect the call. If we establish a call via carrier C and the quality is very poor, with constant delays and interferences, the customer will become unhappy with our services and cancel their contract or subscription with us. How can we totally exclude carrier C from our routing list? There is one more parameter called Huntstop. We can set our Huntstop parameter also in the vendor tariff. We are going to see how it's done in a moment. What does Huntstop mean? Huntstop means that routes with a preference lower than where the Huntstop is set should be ignored by the system. So, as in our example, if we set our Huntstop for carrier D, our carrier C is going to be ignored because its preference is lower than that of D. Any carriers with a preference lower than 4 are going to be ignored by our system. The list is going to be sorted the same way as before. A, B, and D will be at the top, and carrier C will not be present at all. Let's look at routing simulation on our web interface. To exclude carrier C with preference 3, we need to enable Huntstop for carrier D with preference 4. Let's go to our tariff for carrier D, go to our rate, edit, and set the Huntstop. Let's click save. And now let's go back to our simulation. Routing simulation, let's dial our number and click test. Now we see that our routing list only has 3 carriers. Carrier C is excluded because it has preference 3, and the Huntstop is enabled for carrier D with preference 4, meaning that everything below 4 is going to be excluded. Preference, price, and Huntstop were the 3 parameters for basic routing configurations. In the next part, we are going to look at how to fine-tune the system to get even better results.